My name is Gary McDowell. I'm the Executive Director of Future of Research. It's a non-profit organization that began as a one-off meeting in Boston in 2014. Essentially, as a group of postdocs got together to try to respond to this paper that had come out earlier in the year by Bruce Albert, Shirley Tillman, Harold Varmus, and Mark Kirshner. It was sort of talking about the state of the biomedical research enterprise. And we wanted to have a discussion and workshop, like solutions to problems that junior scientists were facing, and then sort of issue like a response to that from the junior science community in Boston. We sort of thought that might be the end of it, to be honest, but actually there were another bunch of meetings around the country following up, and we grew into a non-profit organization, which I now work for full-time. I've been working for just under a year. So we're trying to foster grassroots advocacy amongst junior scientists, facilitate these local meetings for people to get together and discuss some of the issues that junior scientists are facing. But I'm also doing a lot of research and trying to figure out how to increase transparency about the system everyone is going through to try and give you all more information about the realities of academia, the realities of training to be scientists, however you want to do science, and to try and, give back something of an impression of what are the things you're having to face up to and like deal with going through. I'm really honored to be here. Really thanks so much to Sarah and to the committee for inviting me. This is the first time I've really spoken directly to grad students. I tend to be associated very much with postdocs. So I really want to like get to you guys and give you guys some impressions and at least have you start thinking of things that, you should be questioning about this system, and especially in looking for your own direction, your own training. So this is more an instruction to me than to you. I have been a little, sarcastic before in saying that, postdocing is somewhat of has somewhat of a bad rap right now, and What's unfortunate is how often you hear about how the postdoc experience is marred by so many things that we're experiencing. And what I want to get across to you is that there are a lot of people who have really great postdoc experiences. And what I want to help is like try and help you figure out how you can find those great experiences too. Like it is not impossible to do. There's actually a lot of people who really enjoy their postdoc experience. And I want you to, whatever I show you through the data, try and keep in mind that there are ways that you can try and circumnavigate some of these issues. So what is a postdoc? So there's a definition of what the postdoc is from the National Postdoc Association. And the key things are it's a temporary period, mentored research and or scholarly training. You're supposed to be acquiring professional skills, and that's supposed to help you for the career path of your choosing. And I want to emphasize your choosing. The postdoc, though, as you can see, this is a collection of all of the titles that are used for postdocs across the US, 37 different titles, which makes it particularly difficult. So research fellow, I believe, is the title that's used here for postdocs at Michigan. And Michigan is reasonably rare in having only one title. Most institutions have multiple titles, even within their institution, depending on how people are paid, usually at least 3, depending on the mechanism. And so this makes it really difficult to figure out what the postdoc is like, who postdocs are. We don't actually know how many postdocs there are in the US. And so we're trying to figure out, I've sort of written a couple of articles, discussing this and thinking about it. And I'm working with the American Society of Biochemistry and Molecular Biology to try and push institutions to think about how to organize their titles better, that postdocs are all treated the same. So there's a barrier not only in like us figuring out what the postdoc looks like, but also for you trying to figure out what a postdoc is, where people go, what happens to them, what your salaries are, what benefits you get, how long people are postdocing. These are all very open questions. And there's a report from 1969 called The Invisible University that talks about postdocs, and arguably a lot of the things in there we're still working on trying to fix nearly 50 years later. So the postdoc is sort of this, miasma of different kind of things. 70 to 80% of US biomedical PhDs go on to do a postdoc. This is data that comes from 2014. It's the latest that we sort of have, so perhaps it's a little out of date, but this is coming from a number of sources and has been in a number of papers recently. And in particular, we have on the right here a graphical representation of from the survey of earned doctorates, which you all do as you're about to graduate or at the point of graduation from your PhD, talking about what your next plans are. And about 30% of people are definitely committed to postdocs at that point, but 50% of people have no definite plan. And this is kind of the problem, because those 50% are probably all going on to do a postdoc without any perhaps like real idea of anything other than defaulting into it. And that's kind of what I want to make you all think about today, is like, do I need to do a postdoc? But I also want to encourage like that you should do a postdoc if you want to do a postdoc. I don't want to put you off, but I just want to make you think about it, make an informed choice. So this is a sort of graphical representation of data from 2012 done by my colleague Jessica Polka, who is now the director of ASAP Bio, the movement to put preprints to be more used in biology. And you can see that the postdoc, because 80% of biomed PhDs are going into postdocs, it's a critical step that people are going through in their scientific tracks. But it's also this sort of circulating point. The data here says that 30% of postdocs do more than one postdoc. It's hard to know how many postdocs people are doing. That, again, because we don't really know how many there are. We're not really tracking who postdocs are. And some of the data here is a little unsure. For example, how many international postdocs are coming in. So anecdotally, and there's some evidence to support this too, about 2/3 of postdocs in biomedicine are international. NSF data, most recently from 2015, shows that 55% are on temporary visas. So this is a population that is very poorly studied. We don't know. We have some idea of where they come from. We really have no idea where they go after, whether they stay, whether they go, what they do. And so there's a lot of open-ended questions here. Also, how long people postdoc for. You'll see sort of the stated length of postdocing is usually 5 years. Some suggestion it's reduced to 4.5 years. But again, it's hard to know whether this is the true average, because if we're not tracking postdocs and 30% of them do another postdoc, it's unclear how long that actually is. And to give a concrete example, I did a 2-year postdoc at Boston Children's, a 2.5-year postdoc at Tufts. And I'm not currently aware of any data set where I show up as a 4.5-year postdoc, but I show up, I think, probably as 2-year postdocs. And you can imagine the effect that might have on the averages. So it's hard to know. We know of people who are postdocing 8, 10. I had a friend just recommended by someone to do postdoc for 11 years. So this is a thing to bear in mind of how long you want to commit to this, where you want to be. And it's not only, we talk a lot about the pipeline, this idea that there's this linear track through academia, and that academia is the correct outcome. Whereas, in fact, there's a sort of scientific tributary of different places that you can go and different things that you can do, which is worth absolutely you exploring to think about what it is that you do want to do or not. And it's totally fine to commit to academia also, but also just be aware of the reality of the situation we're in. This came out just a couple of days ago, and this is a case study of someone who applied for a postdoc that I know over social media, who applied for a tenure-track job. And I think it's probably fair to say this is not unusual, this data. It's probably fairly consistent. I said to him, I'm quite impressed. I usually expect people get about 10% interview rate based on applications. So he actually got something like 15 here, which is great. But this gives you an idea of the work involved. Applying for tenure-track jobs, people are applying over multiple years through multiple cycles, applying for a vast number of applications. And this is just to give you an idea of the work that is involved when you're thinking about this. And you should be thinking about this really from the beginning of the postdoc. I often say, you should be thinking about this yesterday, but it's never too late to begin thinking about these things. So just an idea of the landscape this is in. And not to depress everyone further, but also we're in this interesting funding landscape where we find that the amount of money going towards early career researchers has been decreasing. Interventions by NIH recently have somewhat stabilized this drop-off, which is the red line you can see here on the right. But because of the increasing cohort of older scientists, late career, 60 and above. The mid-career population has now started to take a turn as the early career has stabilized. So we talk a lot at the moment about losing one generation of scientists, but there's actually genuine reason to be concerned that we might lose 2 generations of scientists with the way things are going. So this is just to give you an idea of how things are in the academic landscape. Make sure you're sort of aware. And of course, not everyone is affected equally by all of these things. So, depending on whether you're coming from an underrepresented minority as well in this system, I really want to flag up the work by Kenny Gibbs, who's at NIGMS. And what graphically is shown here, can you see a dot here? Oh, here, great. So this middle graph here, this shows the growth of underrepresented minorities in the trainee population in biomedicine over the last 25 years. It's grown by about 9-fold and sort of tends towards the exponential. But when you look at the faculty hiring now this is at basic science departments at medical schools in the US, this 9-fold increase has only resulted in a sort of 2-fold increase in faculty hiring. Whereas when you look at well-represented minorities, there's been a 2-fold increase in the trainee population and a nearly corresponding 2-fold increase in faculty hiring. So, there's a lot of work here that needs to be done. This work sort of challenges the argument that there's not a talent pool for hiring for faculty that you will hear a lot, but we know that there are thousands of postdocs from underrepresented minorities in the postdoc population, and we know they're not being hired, and we're trying to figure out whether that's a hiring policy problem at the faculty side, at the search committee side, but also somewhat of an issue perhaps in whether these people feel included and want to apply for these jobs. So that's a very open question at the moment. This also sort of affects funding rates. So this is the Ginther report, which I sort of want to flag in here just because I think more people should know about it. It came out in 2011. It's known informally as the Ginther report, but the title is Race, Ethnicity, and NIH Research Awards. And Black or African American principal investigators are far more unlikely to get R01 funding from this analysis of 2000 to 2006 R01 awards. And this is something that's being grappled with right now through the NIH and the creation of their Office of Workforce Diversity. And something that further ties into this is that academia, there's this idea of the pipeline of academia that you go through to this very sort of linear path, but it also sort of has very homogeneous, rewards and recognition in this pathway. And so, there's a lot of reward for making sure you're getting publications and you're getting grants and funding. And especially I want to sort of highlight this in a lot of concerns people have right now about science in the world. We're not recognizing worldwide the work that people do, that are scientific contributions that include teaching or communicating with the public who funds the research, or doing advocacy work, or even mentoring people properly within labs. These things are sort of left to the individual principal investigator and are often unrewarded. You see a sort of bias in who does service in academia. Again, breaks down with race and gender, and who gets reward and who suffers from this. So these are things to be very cognizant of. And it's interesting that this, again, is another 2 papers by Kenny Gibbs that show that interest in careers differs by race and gender in US biomedical research system. But also when you look interview people, you find that this corresponds very much with personal values. And unsurprisingly, people going into academia are doing it for various personal reasons. Those personal reasons correlate with race and gender. And basically the incentive structure and the reward structure in academia rewards a certain kind of contribution to science. And perhaps this is something to consider in why we're struggling with why faculty is so homogenous right now. So I threw all these things out there, trying to keep you informed with this. So we should probably try and, this is really pessimistic, I'm very sorry. So now we're going to look at the labor market. And this is work that we did in collaboration with labor economists who were formerly at the NIH, but are now at the US Census Bureau. This is looking at the biomedical workforce using US Census data, which a lot of people are turning to now because this data is largely not available in NIH or NSF in particular data sets. And so increasingly, especially to look at international researchers, we're starting to turn to census data. So the graph on the left, what we looked at was through decennial census data and also data from the American Community Survey, which is done every year. Looked at people identifying as biomedical scientists to establish the biomedical workforce. And you'll see that the biomedical workforce grows, decade on decade. This period around here, you'll notice around 2000 is when the NIH doubling happened. So you see a dramatic increase in the population here. And what you might notice here is although the workforce grew slightly between 2010 and 2014, there's actually a contraction in this like dark blue, and this roughly corresponds to the PhD holding population in the biomedical workforce. And so the data that we then went on to analyze, so this is essentially grad students, and the data we went on to analyze then just took this dark blue sampling and looking across years. And so we see the proportion of people in academia from 1990 to 2014 actually halved. This actually bucks a trend from a recent paper on the aging of the scientific and engineering workforce that you might have heard about, where they find that actually the proportion of people within academia in the whole science and engineering workforce was rather consistent over time, but in biomedicine it's actually halved. So there's somewhat of a field dependence. But what's interesting is that we find this also the slight contraction in all groups, but particularly in private, roughly corresponding to industry. And I sort of put this out there. We're not entirely sure what the reason is for this contraction, particularly in the industry workforce. But what seems to be happening with industry is that there's a lot more outsourcing of research and development work to academic labs. There's been quite a dramatic increase in the last few years in this. And this sort of makes sense when you think about it, in that industry can now sort of outsource work to people who are, academic labs who are looking for funding. There's a plentiful supply of cheap labor in the form of grads and postdocs already. And so this is something to think about. The default thing of I'm not going to get into academia is I'm going to go to industry. You have to be very careful of thinking about what the labor market actually looks like. And while a PhD is absolutely great for all kinds of jobs, you have to be very aware to not take that for granted and be thinking about what are the particular things that you need to work on for particular careers that you might be thinking of. Career development is crucial, including for academia. There's another sort of more intense look at the labor market based on jobs that were advertised, and looking at a labor and skills gap analysis of the research workforce that was done by some folks at NIH. The only group in which there is actually a deficit in people coming through is medical scientists, which includes physician scientists, which are a group that is dropping off, particularly in academia. I did look up the titles for these last night, and medical scientists in the definition does include the title postdoc. So I'm unsure whether postdocs are being included in here. I need to double back and check more. But when you look at the sort of total graduate population, you see there's a deficit in the labor market for the number of people being produced versus the number of jobs that seem to be available. When you include postdocs, that gap increases. You'll see this difference here is about 5,000, which seems small for postdocs. And indeed, they wrote in the paper that our estimation of the supply is likely very conservative because, and again, pointing this out, they essentially don't have people who did their PhD abroad and came to postdoc, or who did their PhD abroad and came into the labor workforce doing other jobs, because this data essentially isn't collected. So this is somewhat of an underestimate that already there's a gap in the labor market. So again, just to keep in mind, you should be careful about thinking you can just walk into any job with a PhD. That's all I'm saying. Doesn't mean that you're not going to get them. There's just a lot of very competitive tracks outside of academia. And one I hear being pushed a lot is science journalism and science communication, which is even more competitive, I would say, than academia currently is. So just be aware of the realities of what you need to be doing. So on that note, things that you can do, and what I really want to try and get across is that you should try, if nothing else from this talk, to try and go away feeling a bit empowered that there's stuff that you can do in looking up for your postdoc, your potential postdoc, and things that you should be discussing with potential institutions and potential PIs. And I'm going to talk about something we never talk about in academia, and that is money. And there's this sort of myth culturally throughout biomedicine that all postdocs are being paid on the NIH's scale, the National Research Service Award scale, or at least that they're being paid at the minimum. And in fact, there are people who have even said to me, oh, you know, who assume that this is somewhat of a legal mandate, that institutions have to be paying you this. So first of all, data from the 2014 National Postdoc Association Institutional Policy Report on salary policies showed that 89% of the institutions surveyed did have a minimum policy. Only 93% of them, 93% of them claim to enforce the minimum. It's unclear, based on what I'm looking at right now, whether this is really truly the case, but there's claimed to be a minimum here. But you can see that for 51% of institutions, the minimum does correspond to this, what was currently at the time the NIH NRSA minimum. But you can also see that there's a pretty extensive range of postdoc salary minima that are being suggested by institutions. And I want to point out that this minimum goes down likely to $23,660, which is the legal minimum under the Fair Labor Standards Act that you can be paid as a postdoc. Postdoc salaries will be very hard for you to find, I know, because I've been trying. I do this as a full-time job. So one thing I want to make clear to you also is that you're going to hear a lot how it's kind of your fault that you get into a postdoc and you're in this situation because you should have done your research. I'm doing this as a full-time job. It's really hard. Don't be surprised that you can't find salaries. So it's hard to know what you should be paid, and I want to give somewhat of an indication of what things are using some actual data here. But one thing that is not talked about is that you can negotiate for your salary. You should be having this conversation with your potential PI. This is something that people do, and something that you should feel comfortable doing. And consider, if you don't feel comfortable doing it with the PI you're discussing, or whether it comes up and it's not a great thing, maybe, again, factor these things into your decision. Same as you would in thinking about the science that people do, think also about the environment you're going to be working in. Because if you're going to be in this lab for, on average, 5 years, you want to make sure that you're in a place where you're, able to succeed for yourself. So I'm going to sort of show the University of Michigan salaries based on data that is publicly put up on their website. There's no unified policy across the institution. It's a very large institution with multiple schools, multiple units, and the policy generally seems to be that individual departments and units can decide. In the medical, biomedical realm, it tends to be focusing on, again, the NIH NRSA scale. As part of a resource that we were building looking at recent updates to the Fair Labor Standards Act, we know what the current policy is at University of Michigan. And to set the background a little, some of you may have heard about this change to labor law last year that was essentially raising postdoc salaries. This was because the Fair Labor Standards Act was being updated to raise this minimum of $23,660 to $47,476. It's a very long and interesting story, and I don't want to sort of bore you entirely with it, but we sort of looked into what institutions were doing, trying to figure out what this meant for postdocs, and we we had a list of what each individual institution did and put it up on our website for comparison. And the history of it with the University of Michigan was that they said we're going to raise the salaries. And then when an injunction came through about a week before that the updates were due to come in, just before Thanksgiving, University of Michigan was one of the institutions to sort of suggest that they were canceling the salary raises. However, I want to give a shout out to Tammy Barnes, who put a lot of work into trying to convince the university to raise the salaries again, which they have now done again with this policy of leaving it up to individual units and departments and appreciating the sort of institutional difficulties and minutiae there are involved here. And there's more information on the Fair Labor Standards Act at our link here. All these slides, by the way, I'm going to put up somewhere so you can access them later. It'll be shared around, and you can use all the links and see all the things I'm linking to. So this is a resource for you as well. So the data is up on the website, and one thing I want to sort of make clear to begin with is that the way the salaries are being reported reflects the way postdocs are being administered. So it is unclear whether the salaries that are reported on here are the entire salaries that the postdocs are getting. This is kind of the issue in trying to figure out what postdocs are actually getting. And I don't mean to single out University of Michigan other than the fact that I'm here. I'm actually doing this across a bunch of public institutions through Freedom of Information requests. And this is a consistent theme, that it's unclear what the true salaries really are and what postdocs are really getting. And so what I'm reporting here is the data that is apparently available up on the website. And so there are multiple caveats to this. And this is not a reflection of truly what postdocs are getting, I hope. So in 2014, the reported salaries ranged from $22,500 to $120,000. Two of those salaries are reported under $23,660. Again, they could be getting money from elsewhere. 2016, the salaries ranged from $16,344 to about $95,000, $94,000. There were then 6 salaries that were below the FLSA minimum. I want to point out also, since I've done this analysis, the 2014 data has also appeared, and I had a quick check in there, and there were no salaries below the FLSA minimum there. So there's actually somewhat of a trend of this increase in the number below, and it's unclear whether these are people on fellowships getting money from elsewhere or how they're being paid. So there's potential caveats whether also this is reflecting a part-time postdoc or not. So take that at face value. The number of postdocs who are on an NRSA scale in 2015 and 16 is shown. And again, this is not something that necessarily needs to be mandated across the institution. This is probably a reflection of the people who are in medical school and biomedical departments here. I went through the 2015 and 2016 data because it has everyone's names in, and I can see who was there in 2015, who was there in 2016. I compare their salaries between the 2 years. There was one postdoc who appeared to be on the correct scale in 2015, who then got the corresponding correct raise in 2016 out of about 600 odd postdocs that I saw. 2 postdocs also were raised to above the appropriate level. This was, again, just searching for the actual values of the NRSA scale. So this is just seeing how rigidly people are fixing to the scale and whether they are correspondingly going up. And I use the asterisks around an NRSA scale because the scales that I found being used dated back to the 2006-2008 NRSA salary scale. So postdocs are being paid on a multitude of these different scales. And just as a quick, it's a little confusing how this works for the salary scales for people who are paid on NIH training mechanisms. So I've sort of clarified this with the NIH, and here's my interpretation. What happens is you get a grant, it starts on a certain date, and you follow the salary scale for that year, for the financial year, at that start point. When the grant is renewed a year later, you shift up to starting using the next scale. Where this gets a little confusing is if the postdoc started at a different date to when the grant started. So when the postdoc's annual renewal comes up, they should be moved correspondingly up to the scale currently being used, and that scale may have advanced by a year. They should also increase in years of experience. So for example, you might go from the 2015 year 0 scale to next year being on the 2016 year 1 scale. So the increase is actually not just an increase along the one scale, but the scale itself should be updated every year. So these are just the values that I found corresponding to the scales, and they are ranked from the lowest salary value to the highest with the Fair Labor Standards Act minimum, which was due to come in a month later. This is data from November 1st, sort of shown here of how many postdocs were just put onto the 47,476. The 2016 year 0 for NIH was 47,484, I believe, just slightly higher than the FLSA. And between 2015 and 2016, you can see there was a very marked shift that people were moved up to higher classifications. This was a year in which salaries were being particularly scrutinized, so this sort of makes sense. But you do see in 2016 a lot of people on a lot of random salary scales, particularly the 2015 scale still being used. And sorry, I misspoke. The 2016 year 0. 2017 is the one that came in on December 1st. So some people had already been moved up to this scale, even though it wasn't actually in force yet, including someone on the year 3 scale. The 2016 year scale had been in force actually for just over a year. It came in October 1st, 2015, and went through to December 1st, 2016. So really, between 2015 and 2016, everyone should have advanced on the 2016 scale. So that's just an overview of how it appears to that the NRSA scales seem to have been used through here. And then looking at what salaries what the changes were in the 635 postdocs that I looked at. So 133 people got no raise. The lowest raise was 1 cent. And raises went up to $27,300. Unclear, again, it would be interesting to compare 2014 to 15. 2016 is sort of a weird year because of everything that was happening with the Labor Act. But it's unclear whether this is somewhat of people spotting people who should have been on much higher salaries. Also, confusingly, 6 people got quite significant decreases. And again, this could be due to reporting. Perhaps they got a fellowship. Perhaps they moved on to something else. But there was a decrease of $22,000. That's the largest decrease I saw. So there's a wide range of salaries that you see at institutions. Yes?
Is data derived from W2 forms or 1098 forms? Do you do like a merge of those two to combine what the university pays and what the fellowship they get to add those values up to be able to get a grand total of what they're actually getting?
Sure. So the question is there a way of looking at the W2 and the 1098 forms to see if you can correspond with what they're getting versus what's being reported versus what they might actually be getting? That's a good question. I don't know. I don't know what the legal ramifications of that are, but I can look into it. That's a good idea. Thanks. It may not be possible. I'm not sure, but I'll look. Yeah.
So if you negotiate your salary and then you stay for another year, you say you have to negotiate the salary based on the scale that you're negotiating.
Okay, this is a good question. So if you negotiate your salary and then you renegotiate, and you're on a different scale, perhaps you're not on this, for example, should you renegotiate every year? Yes, you should be negotiating a salary raise every year because the cost of living goes up. And I would put not only salary, but you should be, this should be part of the regular, at least annual, I would argue much more frequently, but at least annually talking about things like your salary, where you're going. You're supposed to be meeting every year about your IDP as a postdoc. That's checked off in a box on NIH forms for grant renewals. So that should be part of the things you're discussing. You shouldn't just be discussing your science, right? You should also be discussing your state of you as a person who's being trained because you are a trainee, and your path towards your scientific career. These are things that should be all-encompassing in an annual sort of review that you should be considering. Yeah.
So the baseline that NIH gives, does it include the benefits that people are also negotiating with their PIs? Maybe they're getting less money because of their sick and they're covered part of it. That's why getting less cash, but it's getting into it.
So the question is, does the NRSA scale include the benefits, and is that being sort of factored in? This is really tricky. So the simple answer is no, the scale does not relate to benefits. That's supposed to be the salary, the stipend. The benefits are very complicated. Even I fully don't understand how benefits truly work at institutions. And the language, and a lot of institutions also don't understand. There's different answers from different institutions, and then when you talk to NIH about how NRSA benefits should work, they actually have given me an entirely different answer too. So it's the simple answer is no. I will talk about benefits in a moment, though. Okay, cool. So this seems to be a problem with the administration of postdocs, right? You can understand there's a lot of issues with titles, and if people are paid in different mechanisms, and some of them aren't being paid through the institution, some people get paid directly by their fellowship agency. This could be hard to tell, but it's interesting to compare, and as part of the Fair Labor Standards Act update, there was an argument made to have postdocs exempted because medical residents are also exempted, and postdocs are like the medical residents of the academic system. So I did a comparison using this data looking at medical residents. The salary, first of all, the salary scale for medical residents at University of Michigan is clearly posted on a website. This analysis I put at the bottom, I was bedridden with a cold at New Year at my parents' house in the Highlands of Scotland, and I was like, well, I'll spend 3 days looking through postdoc salaries because that's what I do for fun. But I then I did the same thing through the medical resident salaries, and it took me 30 to 60 minutes to identify every single medical resident, what year they're in, how many of them there are in each year, that they're all on the salary corresponding to the year they're supposed to be in, that they all got the salary raise between 2015 and 2016 that they should. So I leave that hanging as an example of what can be done. Yeah. And this is something I see, not again just at Michigan, this is something I see sort of across the board. And it's possible to do this. That's something I'm trying to push institutions to do. But this is something you should be aware of. It's very hard to figure out these things. And you can sort of have an idea of some of the ranges that you see. Sometimes we'll go to websites and try to find, so University of California, for example, you go to their salary website, you type in Postdoc, you search, sort by lowest to highest salary. The lowest salary reported on this website is $10. The highest salary is $135,000. So it's hard for you to sort of appreciate what you should be asking for or discussing. And so this is something we need to be talking about more, about valuing ourselves in academia and making sure that people are getting appropriate salaries. Again, looking at the salary ranges, a lot of people are doing very well on salaries. A lot of people are getting surprisingly high salaries. A lot of people are getting very low salaries. Yeah.
So information from public universities are available for you guys to analyze this, but there are also major private institutions that do research. How do you get information from those?
Great. So the question is, how do I get information from the private institutions? Because I can do the FOIA requests, or I can go to websites and try to find this. And there's somewhat of a legal basis for me trying to get the information from public, but how do I get it from private? The question is, like, all you can do is ask. That is what I've started trying to do. One institution, Boston University, has actually given me their salary data because they went through, they harmonized all their postdoc titles, they raised all their postdoc salaries, and it's in their interest to be like, hey, look at all our salaries, they're really great. And all of their postdoc employees are on at least $47,476, apart from one who's earning 4 cents less than that. So, you know, this is a good incentive, I hope, for people making their salaries more available. That this is something that you should be aware of this, right? This is something you should know. And if places are paying well or not, we find a lot of value with my organization in making things transparent to make institutions accountable. I think it's about time that we started, you know, collecting data and like making it clear to you guys how you're navigating through your path and what the reality is. Yeah, so that's the only private institution I have data for so far.
Why not report the data as like a median and report how range? Because I suspect that the people losing 20 grand going on the fellowship, people gaining 20 grand coming off the fellowship. So, I mean,
yeah, so first of all, so why not report the data as a mean and or median and the range? For sure, this is totally preliminary data, and I am absolutely, this data does not likely represent reality of what people are actually getting paid, but is more meant to sort of illustrate that it's very difficult trying to find this out. That was my original intention in going through this data, and especially going through all of the institutions. I've sort of come to the point where I'm basically going to have to put out the raw data as like, here are all the caveats with this raw data. You can compare all the institutions, but I can't draw any significant analysis across institutions because of all these different problems with, I don't know who's actually getting paid what. You know, who's actually on, you can sort of tell who's on the NRSA salary scales. And that's like one indicator, but again, that's very patchy. So this data is super hard to be working with. And so the story I'm sort of trying to tell now, moving forward with this project, is I can find out this information very easily for other groups like medical residents. It's very hard to find for postdocs. Trying to, you know, I'm sort of calculating at the moment as I go through and get the institutional responses what the means and the medians are, and trying to, like, for example, do that by taking out all of the ones that are below the FLSA, assuming that those are all incorrect. And, you know, at the moment, the sort of mean and median are coming out at about $43,000 for postdoc salaries in the US. But that's only with about sort of 5-6% of the population of postdocs estimating so far in. So for sure, this data is super preliminary, and it's basically just a very quick analysis that anyone could do off the public website. And I want to make that sort of clear too. Like, this is what someone sitting at home did using publicly available data. But I want to sort of also highlight that you as a potential postdoc might be trying to find this stuff out too. And this may also be unclear that this is not reality. It's very hard, it's sort of frustrating trying to figure out what to do with this. Yeah. So not only may postdocing not be financially wise in the short term, there's actually a paper that came out recently by Can and again Donna Ginther, Ginther appearing again, the impact of postdoc training in early careers in biomedicine. This again shows that, well, I told you before, 80% of PhDs in the US, this is data on US citizens who did PhDs in the US, and 80% of them go from PhD into postdoc. You can see as the PhD population increases, so does the postdoc population. And across a range of different career tracks, it was found that generally, if you did a postdoc, you would still, after 15 years, for most career tracks, be earning less than your colleagues who, on average, did not do postdocs. And there's some indication that perhaps this may never converge. So this is sort of to give an idea of, again, you are making somewhat of a commitment to, when you're doing a postdoc, you're sort of discouraged from thinking about money, but this generation, and especially when training times are the way they are, and people are training through their 30s, which is exactly when you should be saving for retirement, people are trying to have children. It's an important time to be making sure you have money. And my argument is that this should not be a selection factor for academia. People shouldn't be leaving because they can't afford to be there. So finding information on benefits. So benefits is very complicated to try and figure out, even within an institution for various different groups of postdocs. The Boston Postdoc Association, which is a group of all of the postdoc associations in the Boston area, got together, and this poster, there was no way that I could put this up with a resolution that you could actually read, but I sort of put up the legend here of the sort of things that they have in this poster, and it's actually put up again in the same area where the slides will be for this talk. And they also have their own website, bostonpostdocs.org, and you can find the benefits info in there. They've done and that's where all the raw data is as well, so you can sort of dig deep into the data that is in this poster and summarized here. And again, this is, sort of showing things that you may not often hear about or discuss, whether there's a dental plan, whether there's childcare, whether there's family leave. These are things that you're not encouraged to ask about, but they're things that you should be asking about and thinking about. Again, their salary data is based on the salaries. These are pretty much all private institutions in the Boston area. So the salary data is based on what they are being told the scale is, the scale that is has been given by the institution, but it's very institution dependent, again, as to whether that salary is enforced and whether people are checking up whether postdocs are getting that salary. So again, it will be up to you, your postdoc, to make sure you're getting paid, you're getting the benefits you're supposed to be getting, that kind of thing. So these are the takeaways on the sort of money side. I realize this is going very slowly, I'm sorry. You'll hear a lot that it wasn't about money in my day. This sort of ignores all of the different consequences of going through the academic track 20, 30 years ago versus going through now. And there's a bunch of data that is very different about, about the experience people are having. So don't listen to that. There are postdocs being paid very little and postdocs being paid very well. So make sure you're on the latter half of that equation. There are institutions where if you apply for fellowship, and I'm about to move on to fellowships now, and I'll try and go through this quickly, where you might lose your salary or your benefits if you take a fellowship. I know of people who have turned down fellowship opportunities because they've lost their childcare. There are institutions who don't do this, and so try and find out whether your institution does this or not. Do they treat fellows the same as staff, postdocs? Try and find that out. That's something to ask at the institution or ask when you're visiting or discussing. So there's a bunch of things to think of when looking at fellowships, and I have the NIH info for K awards and so on. You should be thinking about that early on if it's something you want to do. Having fellowships that's shown makes you more likely to be funded for other kinds of things further on. So it's a good place to if you can get your feet in the ladder at some point and you're planning to stay in academia, this is a strategy to go for. pick who to work with. Particularly think about assembling a team of co-mentors. And this sort of applies across to, don't just be thinking about your PI, but also if you're thinking about other kinds of jobs, find a PI who's willing to also let you sort of talk with other people or who knows someone who's maybe in the field that you're interested in going into. A bit like having a committee, which I know that you guys tend to do for grad school in the US. Think also about, think about that for your postdoc too. Plan your research plan and your training goals as thoroughly as you're planning your research. And a quick plug for iBiology's new course, Planning Your Scientific Journey, which is in beta testing right now. I just want to highlight there's this great program called ARACTA, which is for generating postdocs who are interested in teaching and having teaching positions in academic institutions. Their outcomes are here. I think it's a great program because it is training you in how to teach, pedagogy. Produces a lot of faculty. 70% of their alumni go on to be academic faculty and across a range of institutions. And what's key there is that they're rewarding incentives that are not just papers and grants, but they're actually rewarding you on how well you're teaching. And everyone I know who's gone through the program or who is currently in it really loves it. So it's, I sort of like to push it a lot. But this gives you an idea that there are things out there that can be non-traditional academia that you can be thinking about. They're across a range of programs, and you can find that on their website too. And also when you're thinking about career development opportunities in places, it's not very easy to find out where those things are going on at the moment. The other example is the sort of NIH BEST programs that are on right now. So also check those out where there's a lot of career development work going on in there. And they'll be reporting out soon later on this year on how well their programs are going and what they're doing and what the future plans are. It's interesting that I have to sort of point this out, but this is something I emphatically am having to point out many, many times. If you're called trainees, you should be given access to training, and training should be available for you in some way, shape, or form. I often get told a lot by people from institutions, the institutional side, that postdocs are all trainees. The postdocs shouldn't be considered employees, they're all trainees. And the very quick question to ask is what are the metrics that you're using to see whether their training has been successful? What percentage of your postdocs are meeting those metrics and those criteria? How do those criteria change over their time in postdoc training? Usually there's not really an answer to satisfy these, and it usually comes down to whether or not they publish papers, which can be perhaps a metric, but is not the only metric. And I'm sure you all publish papers too, so I want you to consider whether that is a useful thing for you to spend another 5 years just publishing papers. The training of trainees needs a lot of improvement, and this came up in a recent Council of Graduate Schools report that sort of sheds a lot of light, and I've put a link to that there too on the sort of lack of consistent training, the sort of differences in ability of or availability of training. And again, you should think about the institution you're going to, whether training is available, if that's what you're looking for. And this also includes stuff that needs, you need to be doing to be a PI, which, you spend all your time mentoring and managing people and running a lab. You don't spend all your time at a bench, and that's what a lot of postdocs are doing. So again, it's great to be spending a lot of time at the bench doing science, but you should have access to training for the stuff that you need for career development. Everyone needs career development. Find an institution that provides you resources. Find a PI who will let you leave the lab for training. There's a lot of emphasis that it's all on you to do your own training. I've seen that grads and postdocs should be doing their own training on career development, rigor and reproducibility, which I personally think is nonsense. And there's a lot of expectation heaped on you that this is all your responsibility. I'm going to argue that it's not, but be aware that this expectation can be there in some places. And you'll need to advocate basically for your own access to training. Okay, reasons not to default postdoc. Don't do it to delay a career decision unless you're specifically going to a place with lots of these career development things available, and that's really your goal of what I'm doing in a postdoc is to figure out explicitly what to do next and do it seriously by researching it. You see a lot of postdocs who are or grad students who will be like, I will defer this decision to my postdoc, and of course, you work all the time in your postdoc at the bench. You're going to find yourself 3 years later, you'll be no further on in your career development, career planning, and you will find yourself in the same position at the end of your postdoc as you were at the end of your PhD. So don't do that. if you're looking for things like industry, try and find explicit places where they will help you. Don't just assume that doing any postdoc will do it. There seems to be this sort of assumption that any postdoc can walk into industry. I did my last postdoc in frog, developmental biology, and left-right patterning. I'm under no illusions that industry was looking to hire me for my frog experience. If you're doing a postdoc in cancer immunology, that's a different matter. So consider that. And don't do it because you feel you should. What you do is your business. Like, this is your life. You shouldn't do it. You shouldn't feel guilty about leaving. I realize that's tough to say, even knowing all the stuff that I did. I had an incredibly hard time leaving academia. But it's still up to you, like what you should do. Don't feel like you're obligated to do it. And I want to finish on a positive note. Doing science for a few years in this environment can be super fun. Like, it's really fun just to be doing a bit of science. Just make sure you're in the environment that makes you happy and that you're happy doing it. It can be extremely rewarding when everything lines up and you're in the right lab, you're in the right institution, perhaps you have access to the resources you need. Obviously do it if you want to be an academic. I'm not trying to tell people not to be going to academia. I just want to make sure that you're like aware of the things that you're coming up against. And also some of these resources you might want to share with people who tell you that it was always tough and it was tough in my day too, and you can sort of show it's actually gotten worse in many realms. So feel free to pass that on. Training in another field, moving into like an entirely different thing. Frankly, for your own reasons, like you might be on a visa and you might need to stay in that way. That is fine. You might find that there are no other jobs that you can find. That's also fine. Like, don't. It's not a problem to do that, but again, be like cognizant of all these other things. Like, life is life, and things work out the way they work out. Just be aware of a lot of these things, and make sure you can still end up in a great place doing a great postdoc, even if the job market is not what it is, what you would desire right now. And to develop your independence, postdocs are supposed to be independent in a sort of being mentored, being developed and nurtured in this independent state. You're not there explicitly to be doing someone else's experiments for them. That's not what a postdoc is supposed to be for. I hear a lot of postdocs sort of in that situation. You're supposed to be independent and developing your own project, because the idea is you're then going to go off with that project somewhere else. You need to make sure you're in an environment where that is what you're doing. Don't just be at the bench for someone at someone else's behest. Thanks. And here's a bunch of places where you can follow things. I'm a co-PI on an NSF grant, and most of the funding that gives me my job is from Open Philanthropy Project in Silicon Valley. So thank you very much. Yeah, so this is the question is sort of showing the convergence of postdoc salaries of people with a postdoc versus without a postdoc, and the idea that in industry, that people come from industry and say, we need postdocs, like we're hiring postdocs, right? That's what you're asking. Like, it's hard to get straight from a PhD into an industry position. This is really interesting. I have heard all sorts of things from people in industry, and I've seen all sorts of examples of people being hired in certain ways. I'm a little bit cynical about this industry needing a postdoc argument, to be perfectly honest. If you want to do a postdoc and go into industry, I would recommend looking into industry postdocs, because they seem to be pretty good programs. Getting a postdoc, I heard someone from industry say, oh, it's great to have postdocs come on because they've been through this awful system, and so they're like, literally they say this, like, that they're they're determined. I'm not, the idea that you should martyr yourself for science, I'm not in favor of. I think because 80% of PhDs are postdocing, people are hiring postdocs by default. And, there's all sorts of interesting questions you can ask. Again, like the outsourcing of people into academic labs and that work being done there. Also, there's maybe some indication that industry salaries have started to go down a little, perhaps because of a glut of all of these very qualified people. You know, industry can hire. It's an interesting question. I've found this, it's very hard to try and figure out how to get it into industry, and it seems that industry is not very willing to share its data on like who gets in at what stage, you know, and whether you really need the PhD or the postdoc or whatever to do these things. So it's something to be aware of. I know there are places in industry where they do hire people out of PhD. You know, you hear the counter argument of like, if you're in a postdoc, we don't want to hire you because you've been so embedded in academia for so long. So it depends who you talk to, and the key thing, especially with industry, is trying to network. And like the thing I hear constantly is that if you have a like direct route to someone in HR, or someone can pass on your thing from it to someone in HR to the right person, that's how you get your in. So networking is actually super important. And networking, you know, being like, you know, I network by like going to seminars and like hanging around after and drinking beer and talking about what I do. Like that's networking, right? So trying to just get out of the lab and talk to other people about what you're doing, what you're interested in. But yeah, for sure, with the industry stuff, there's a lot of mixed messages in there. Yeah. Hi.
Okay, so if you have a position that you have had in mind as a goal, and it does require a sponsor for sure.
Yeah.
But with all of this new information that I did not know, where we now have the ability to negotiate for a salary, and that can be a really bad thing too, right? And cost potential. Is there any sort of resource for us to do that negotiating so that if say we have to let
That's a good question. So the question is, are the resources to sort of help you negotiate or give you a guide of like how to negotiate on the salaries? Because you know, essentially there's so much supply, right? Like there's so many PhDs, and you know, there's a perception that the PI perhaps has the leverage because they could ask anyone. I don't know explicitly of any resources for sure yet. I know this is something that's been discussed at a couple of like National Postdoc Association meetings, so it might be worth checking out the National Postdoc Association website and just sort of searching there for negotiating tactics. I think something might have been written on that. It is interesting to see somewhat from the perspective of the PI/institution that there is a sense that they do need to try and attract good people. And, you know, one could argue that if you're in there negotiating for things, you're probably someone who's like very like, you know, someone who's going to be a useful person in there if you're like challenging things and being, you know, sort of stirring things up a little, I would argue. I would want someone, if I wanted to hire a postdoc and someone who's supposed to be going towards independence, I'd be pretty keen to have someone come in and be like, okay, like, what are you going to pay me? Let's discuss this, right? Like, I think that's sort of indicative of like, you know, will that also happen in the science? Will you do what you're told, or like, will you challenge the PI? And a good PI, hopefully, will want to be challenged. So that really comes down to like the individual circumstance, right? You may figure this out with the PI and whoever. Yeah, hard to know explicitly of resources, but yeah, certainly you can use so a lot of people go off the NIH NRSA scale. What I would do is say, hey, the National Academies in 2014 recommended that postdoc salaries should be at minimum $50,000 in 2014 dollars plus cost of living adjustment. So if you want to go away and do that calculation, which for Boston is $63,000, and try and start from there as a negotiating position, like that's a thing that has been recommended by the National Academies that people should be doing. So that's a fairly decent place to go. Yeah. Hi.
One comment off of that last thing, and then I actually have sort of a related question. First, as a spouse of a new faculty, it can be really hard to get postdocs that only pay $50,000. It's a finite amount of money on the grant or a finite amount of money on a start. So, as much as you want to, so I'm doing a second postdoc now, so I've been really thinking about this. So, as much as you do want to be valued, you also want to know that there are restrictions on both, right? If you want to be valued and faculty member also wants to make sure your dollars are going as far as that was just a comment based on what you said. The question I had was going back to the underrepresented minority hiring problem. I heard a statistic, and I honestly don't remember where the statistic comes from, that the top 5% of labs fill 50% of the tenure jobs. So these top 5% labs being, you know, the Howard Hughes labs, the very well-renowned
So, do you think it could be possible that the lower number of underrepresented minority tenure track hires is a symptom of underrepresented minorities doing postdocs in not top 5%? So I heard the statistic in the context of women, in that if the statistic is true, top 5% of labs filling 50% of jobs, if that PI is male, tends to have a mostly male postdoc group. If that PI is female, it tends to be a whole split. So when you do those numbers, it's like a resource advantage for males to get jobs, right? So do you think it could be similar consequences that underrepresented minorities just aren't postdocing in quote unquote right?
Okay, so I'll try and distill that down for the microphone. So the comment, first of all, on, like that postdoc salaries is hard to negotiate. Also, you have to appreciate the funding position that the faculty comes from. And this is some weird technicality that I also discovered recently, is that if all of your PI's funding is from NIH sources, they can't pay you any more than the NRSA scale. If they have private funding from elsewhere, they can give you more, like the 50,000 or whatever, but they can actually be restricted if all of their funding is federal to only that. So that is something, they're therein have the conversation with the PI, for sure. But, that's a very, very good point, well taken. In terms of, is the problem, so the question was, is the problem with the lack of underrepresented minorities in faculty perhaps a product of underrepresented minorities not postdocing in the labs of the elite people who tend to fill all the places? I don't have the data on that, and I don't particularly want to comment either way. I don't want to say something that, it's not my place to say, to be honest. What I can say is that the data I think you cited about fewer women being hired by male faculty is the work by Jason Shelser, which I think is in eLife, or no, is PNAS maybe. It's Jason Shelser, who's at Cold Spring Harbor. And yeah, he showed that there's fewer women hired by elite male faculty labs. That might give an indication that on the hiring side, again, perhaps postdocs are not being hired by these faculty. And it's sort of this is a really difficult question that I considered putting in the talk about, how far should you game the system? There's a certain number of institutions where most faculty come from. If you're really serious about wanting to become faculty and you want to game it to your advantage, you could argue that you could go to one of those institutions. I don't support that, but that is a strategy one could use, right? So it's a very complex thing. And, also in coming down with, underrepresented minorities in different labs, there's all sorts of different questions of how well the mentoring is and how inclusive the environment is. And we know we're doing a terrible job at that. So it's an interesting question. I would love to ask Kenny Gibbs about that, actually. But yeah. Thank you.